These guests are all members of the Eisenhower Speakers Program. And what that program has done now for 50 full years is to provide an opportunity for people from the War College, the most senior level of education provided for U.S. military, to interact with members of the public, to share perspectives. They will be talking about U.S. policy as it exists today, but they are not here to promote U.S. policy. They're here really to reflect on the nature of the challenges that confront us as a nation, predominantly from a military perspective, but crossing into other spheres of endeavor as well, and to hear from and engage with members of the public. So we're terrifically proud to have them here today. This is the first time that we've hosted this program at Baruch College, and we are just so delighted that you are here with us. I'd like to acknowledge that the Dean of the War College is here as well as the Director of the Eisenhower Program. So, welcome to Baruch, welcome to the Marxe School, and Trina, if I could ask you to start us off.
Well, thank you everyone for having us here this morning. As already mentioned, I'm Colonel Trina Rice. I'm a native New Yorker, graduated from Cardinal Spellman High School, for those of you all familiar. I graduated from Virginia Tech. I've been in the Army since, 1993, so I've served just over 26 years. I began as a missile defense officer, and currently for the last 15, 20 years nearly, I have served as a human resources officer. And already noted, I am currently a student at the War College. I arrived there from the Pentagon, so that was the assignment where I worked prior to the War College. And departing the War College, I will move to Germany, where I will serve as the senior human resources officer for all of Army forces in Europe.
Terrific, thank you. Mike.
So good morning, I am Colonel Mike Bain. It's nice to be back in this area. My dad's from upstate New York, mom's from Jersey area, so I haven't gotten out this far too much. My dad was a retired Navy officer, so this is my 27th move this summer in my life. Took 15 schools before I finally graduated high school, all across the country, born in Japan, and kind of been moving ever since. I've served about 21 years in the Army as an engineer officer. Came on active duty in '98. Fought in Iraq, also served in Afghanistan. Iraq was as a company commander, wounded there once, and then continued to serve. And then at Afghanistan, running kind of the theater engineer brigade, looking over the entire country. After this, we'll head out to JBLM, where I will command an engineer brigade. And we're looking forward to getting back out to the West Coast and seeing a good part of the country.
Terrific. Thank you so much, V.
Thank you, David, and thank you for everybody for coming here, and thanks to Baruch College collectively for welcoming us to this venue. My name is Colonel Vilius, or V. Leskis. It's a Lithuanian name. Everybody calls me V for short. I'm a Special Forces officer. I have a broad swath of experience within the military, starting off as a commissioned infantryman in the 82nd Airborne, becoming a Special Forces officer, having the opportunity to spend most of my time actually in 10th Special Forces Group out of Fort Carson, Colorado, where I had the opportunity to serve in Iraq during 3 separate rotations. Since then, though, I had an opportunity to serve in the Joint Staff. I worked with wounded warriors over the Warrior Transition Brigade over Walter Reed. And I've had a chance to work in human resources, and I just came from Germany over at Special Operations Command Europe. As far as academic realms go, I have my undergraduate degree in geography from California State University Northridge and a Juris Doctor from Western Michigan. So, thank you.
Terrific. So a distinguished panel, a wealth of experience, and a lot to explore over the course of this next hour and a half or thereabouts. So I'd like to begin with a question for all three of you that really speaks to the title of our program this morning, and this is this notion of the forever war. Although wars may be something of a misnomer because nothing has been declared, of course, in the last 7 decades. And I wonder if you could all reflect a little bit on what this notion of very long-term conflict, nearing 2 decades in Afghanistan, decade and a half in Iraq, et cetera, what it does to our role in the world, our capacity to respond more generally, and the nature of popular support for whatever it is that we need to do to keep ourselves safe in the 21st century. And why don't we start at the other end of the table with V?
No, thank you. I appreciate it, David. So, and this is it's an interesting question because we have to, I think, to a certain degree, reconcile obviously what we perceive things from the military side of the house with regard to strategic realms and thinking in terms of political arms and political aims and what we're trying to achieve and what we have been trying to achieve for the duration of the entire conflict now going on 19, 20 years of war in Afghanistan in particular. And it is a challenge. It is a challenge from the eyes and lens of folks within the military that are continuously doing rotations that have to engage in the day-to-day conflicts as they get on the ground. And there are still skirmishes to be had. There are still wounded and dead that are coming back. And it is still a thing that we have to be cognizantly aware of, not only as a military, but I would argue as a civilian populace. As a governance, as a people in America, that we don't lose sight of what is truly going on a continuous basis. Because once that divide and schism happens to that degree, well, it's very easy to send military folks on in a frivolous way to different locations to do different things, and putting folks in harm's way. So part of this is an aspect of bridging that civil-military divide, I think, with regard to communication. And this is obviously one of these venues where it provides us the opportunity to be able to discuss this in those terms. Part of it also comes from a political realm and thinking in terms of what are we nested purely with our national interests? Are the end states clear? And have we, over the course of time, muddied the waters with regard to understanding our goals and end states that we're trying to achieve with the means or the concepts of how we're actually conducting this? And that is a very challenging thing to reconcile as well. And from a political perspective, that's something that obviously our administration has to continuously think through and reconciling. They're going to receive the best military advice, but we're deep in the throes of the fight. The military has, once you've broken the glass, in essence, the military is there. And this is one of those things that I think that we're seeing with regard to our national security strategy and thinking in terms of vital interests. One of the things that our Secretary of Defense, Mattis, had espoused here is making sure that we're thinking in terms of, nested with our national security strategy under President Trump, is that we're thinking in terms of preserving the peace by preparing for war. We're thinking about deterrence and how are we going to ensure that our forces are ready to be able to fight now, thinking about near-peer competitors, but we're still back down to the having to conduct counterinsurgency and now security force assistance operations across for the global war on terrorism itself. Once that glass has been broken, the military is doing what it has to do in order to address the issues. We can provide our best military advice, but it's the dynamic of the people and their representatives to decide what that end state's truly going to be. So I think that we have to think in terms of how are we going to clean up that muddied waters between the means and the ends to try to make sure that the end state is clear for us to be able to achieve those political goals.
Well, let me suggest, responding to one of the implicit questions that you asked, that our goals are not terribly clear. They are in terms of the strategy issued when General Mattis led DOD. But there are multiple shifting targets. We've got the whole notion of non-state actors. I would argue not a particularly acute and keen perception among the population at large about what our goals are within any given conflict, much less the totality of conflicts if we add them all up. And I just wonder, and Trina, I want to turn to you next, how this affects the ability to recruit to the military, how it affects the perception of the military in society, and ultimately the effectiveness of the force with, again, and please correct me if you believe that I'm wrong about this, in terms of popular perception at least, shifting targets, goals, and strategies.
So with that being said, I'll note that my most recent tour to Iraq ended in 2017. While there, one of the things that we often don't have the opportunity to see here back at home is how serving with other countries, militaries, is so very important. As mentioned earlier, talking about former Secretary Mattis, allies and partners, they are critical. We won't be able to go forward alone. I mean, that is a given, and I think everyone realizes that. The president is often noting, other countries needing to be able to step up, being able to provide more to their own security. And so seeing that as part of my last tour, that exists. I mean, we had over 20 countries that were participating in Iraq currently. And before we left, we'd added 2, 3, maybe 5 additional countries. So we're not out there doing that alone. And that's one of the things that we unfortunately don't get to see here at home, because many feel that it's America that's doing everything. And really, there are a lot of other countries that are participating. And so from the recruiting standpoint, that's one of those things that we don't realize that you get the opportunity to do. Learn what's going on elsewhere in the world. And so being able to understand what else is going on in the world, it helps you to be able to reflect what's going on in your own world. It helps us back here at home to better understand our policies, to help us better understand, what the strategies are. So when we hear our national leaders talk about different political goals, these are what our strategies are, these are what, our interests are. We better understand that, because we're working side by side, shoulder to shoulder, if you will, with members of other nations. And so being able to understand what their interests are and how they work together with our own, it makes for a better coalition, if you will. So I would argue that that's something that we take for granted or fail to realize as a national, as a nation.
I was going to say, very much underreported, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's
Yes.
not something that really is front and center in people's popular perception of any of these engagements
Correct.
around the world. I wonder, Mike, if, staying with this theme and picking up on the notion of the Mattis defense strategy as it was articulated about a year ago, if memory serves. So that's a pivot to a great power conflict notion. I mean, I'm painting with a very broad brush. When many of the conflicts in which you all have been directly involved are contests against non-state actors, are shoring up defenses against something that's far short of shooting war. I'm thinking about cyber warfare. I'm thinking about the movement of troops on the border on the western border of Russia, particularly, and into the northern region around the Baltic states. How is it that you square that strategy with the operational needs of fighting non-state actors and of dealing with non-traditional modes of warfare?
What is democracy worth? For the last 20 years, we have been ingrained in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I've been kind of at the operational and tactical level, kind of in the grain of things. And now I've had the opportunity at the Army War College to kind of step back and say, okay, what are we doing as a nation? What are our values? What is going to occur in the 21st century? If you look at the economic power democracies had at the end of the 20th century, it was 90% of the world GDP. That is now down to about 75% of the world GDP. So in 20 years, we have shifted a lot of the world's GDP to autocracies, predominantly China, and they are testing us, and this competition is now growing. Some nations, such as the European nations, really want to focus on the cooperation side. That is, in some cases, the autocracies method is use cooperation as a means so we can work together, but continue transferring your economic power to us, and we'll continue to grow strength. So what is going to occur?
Italy's sign on
Absolutely.
to One Belt, One Road?
That is competition in the realm of cooperation. And it would be nice to avoid conflict over the next 30 years, but as autocracy grows in the next 30 years, who do we hinge our alliances and partnerships to? As you look at trade and this trade dispute that we're in, when we start to reduce trade barriers, who do you reduce trade barriers with first? Perhaps you do it with democracies. Perhaps you shift your production areas to India, and let them grow faster as a democracy, so you have these regional partners that you can rely upon. Brazil as another example. So what is the role of democracy in the 21st century? And then what is the military's responsibility in this democracy? We are a means, we are a way to achieve cooperation and competition, and also the conflict realm, but there are many other places in the government and in all governments that you can do cooperation or competition in, all avoiding conflict as much as possible. But it does concern me when I visit places visit, go down here in New York City and go to the gift shop, and where are the things made at? Are we purchasing things in autocracies that they're now taking the profits from, and they're going to purchase missiles that will eventually kill our soldiers with? That is a concern over the next 30 years as we move forward.
Could you reflect a little bit further on how you would align policy with what you just articulated? The notion that we don't want, from an economic point of view, to be bolstering regimes that are ultimately going to be our opponents. And if we posit a world where everybody is an economic competitor of everybody else, alliances notwithstanding, the idea is that every deal should make us a little better off than we were, right? How do we operationalize that in policy, and what are the specific military impacts?
So the two theories I'd look at is a capitalist peace theory, which is if we have economic interconnectedness and trade, we won't have conflict. But that has really grown autocracies over the last 20 years. The other one is a democratic peace theory, that democracies don't fight each other. So which theory do you really want to apply your economic power into? I, as a policy, looking at it from a policy outsider perspective, although executing the policy from a military side, would really look at the democracies as a place, democratic peace theory, to invest in. If you're going to invest somewhere, invest in democracy. But I also recognize investing in autocracies such as China has raised millions and millions of people out of poverty, yes, which is a wonderful thing. I met with Chinese military officers in December from the People's Liberation Army, and one of their comments was, a role of a great power is to raise people out of poverty. If the United States will not do it, we will. That was their statement directly, which meant if wherever there is poverty in the world, they will continue to invest. And as they invest, unfortunately, they don't pull out of the area. You know, they go there with 50,000 folks. We have an officer from Nigeria in the Eisenhower program, and he talks about how China really makes investments into these areas. They come with tens of thousands of people, and then they never leave. And in some cases, the states may not have a policy to deport people who've been in their country for a very long period of time. So what is the role of the United States as a great power to help guide other great powers, such as Brazil and India and other European powers, as we continue into the 21st century?
We're hearing a number of themes, or at least I'm hearing a number of themes, of interconnectedness of our economic policy, of our military force, of our ability to work with other nations, crafting alliances toward common ends. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this question of opposition to autocracies. And I want to just pick two autocrats. We have a lot we could choose from, but let's talk about Vladimir Putin. Let's talk about Recep Erdogan, and trying, taking that area from the Eastern Mediterranean up to the Baltic Sea. Can you reflect a little bit on military challenges that they pose, both with respect to the shakiness of the alliance, thinking about Turkey, but also the unique challenges that Vladimir Putin and his Russia pose for Eastern European states and the integrity of the EU?
Mm-hmm. That's that's two separate dynamics that actually could cover down the entire discussion here, frankly. So
we have faith in you,
though. So when we think in terms of Erdogan, I think that that is an ongoing push from a democratic arm from a diplomatic arm within the instruments of national power, and that is that's persistence. I think from a military side of the house, I think a lot of our engagements that we want to try to garner with regard to partnerships and having the opportunity to train with them, to try to then further foster those types of relationships, have diminished over the course of time. They perhaps could be a little bit more on an upswing again, but at last I've seen, it seems that it's still been somewhat problematic. The relationship that Erdogan and Putin have is very pragmatic in its nature, and it's tenuous. So and it is whatever is to the benefit, I think, of what President Erdogan is, and for Turkey collectively is going to be is in the interests of Turkey as a whole. So they do a very fine job. I think Turkey does a fine job of playing both cards on both sides with regard to the NATO alliance, thinking in terms of the relationship with the European Union, and then obviously maintaining a tight relationship as best it can with President Putin. Putin, on the other hand, is a very, very different element, and I think that this is obviously our bigger concern, thinking in terms of where we're at currently in our near-peer adversary competition, and much of this discussion, I think, is focused now towards where our joint doctrine has shifted over the course of time, where our chairman, nested with the Secretary of Defense and with the President of the United States, has been espousing the thinking and the change of thinking in terms of where we currently stand in a competition short of war. This competition short of armed conflict is a notion that's been here, I think, throughout history, but it's doctrinally espoused now, and I think it's better and more readily understood, I think, by the force, because we're simply in kind of reacting, I think, when we think in terms of Putin and his chief of defense, Gerasimov, was able to put out what many people call the Gerasimov Doctrine, but he put in a full spectrum that really equates to an understanding that there's a spectrum of conflict and war, and that Russia is always thinking in terms of always being at war. And is that where we're at? And that's the interesting thing, because that's an unsettling idea, especially within a democracy that is very counter to that notion of thinking in terms of always being at war. We don't like that. Nobody does. We want to try to preserve peace, and that is really our end state goal. And deterrence is it for us with regard to Russia. So now I know you discussed, David, briefly, and you kind of tossed in the cyber aspect, and now we're thinking further with regard to space technologies, and now expanding into a space force. And how are we thinking in terms of that competition short of armed conflict effectively to ensure that we're continuing to deter Russia from potential revanchist elements, from further expansion, now that we've seen what President Putin has done in Ukraine and continues to maintain instability in Donbas, obviously in Georgia prior to that. Right. And so I think part of this is it's incumbent on the sovereign states that are within the peripheral realms themselves to make sure that they're thinking in terms of beyond NATO alliances. NATO is the absolute biggest deterrence, I think, for those that are allied members, and for partners to be able to look towards NATO as being somebody, an element, a treaty of significance even for them as peripheral states. But the nations have to rise up to be able to say, hey, we need to have the individual capability and capacity to be able to actually address issues with regard to President Putin. And I think that President Trump and the administration, by pushing forwards, even Secretary Mattis pushing forward the requirements for increasing the 2% to focus on 2% of their GDP to focus towards that military element, is doing that in and of itself within the peripheral states. But Russia is looking beyond where they're currently at and beyond even the buffer, what they would construe as buffer states along their peripherals. They're looking at proving themselves and trying to raise themselves up to become peers with the United States, so that instead of having perhaps what some perceive as a bilateral world now with China raising up to that level with the United States, which I would argue we're not entirely there yet, but they would love to have some multipolarity in the world. And now I'll bring it back to where Syria and President Erdogan has come into play, because they're trying to look at proving themselves that they have a global capacity to project their global power elsewhere as well. I would argue that Russia, and especially with the sanctions ongoing, is going to be fairly limited over the horizon unless things really turn around economically. And President Putin is only going to have, I think, so much in his capability to project that power. With our removal from Syria, as President Trump has emphasized that we're going to be doing over the horizon, it will be incumbent upon President Putin and the Russian Federation to try to fix a location that has had upwards of 14 million displaced individuals, not only internally but externally as well, that will come back. And again, it's one of those, the military aspect is broken glass. Once that glass is broken, how are you going to go all the way through to the end state to reestablish some semblance of stability in a nation? And the Russian Federation is going to have some issues trying to resolve that.
I want to come back to Syria in a moment, but Trina, I wonder if we can stick with Vladimir Vladimirovich for a moment. And you know, while obviously Syria is the much hotter engagement right now, Russia, despite all of its economic problems, has been spending liberally in Africa, has been challenging in some respects the PRC and their ability to attract political support and build infrastructure. Two questions based on that. Number one, how serious a threat do you see that as Russia tries, to use V's term, to establish to move from near peer to a genuine superpower co-equal, at least as perceived in the world and wide, vastly different economic circumstances, vastly different social supports, but that seems to be one of the goals. And if we're going down that road, in an era where, as you point out, our alliances are absolutely vital operationally and strategically, yet we don't talk much about that. We're in a period where we talk about America going it alone. Can you reconcile all of that for me?
Well, the fact that we have a lot of allies and partners who want to ally, and then we have countries who want to align themselves with America, I think we have to take advantage of that. If not, that is how I believe that Russia will continue its surge towards becoming a major power, possibly even a superpower, as it believes it would like to be. At some point, we will have to acknowledge that we will not be able to do so alone. There will be other parts of the country that we don't, or other parts of the world that we don't have access to, that we will need access to. And we must continue to build partnerships. We must look to build relationships with countries we haven't even thought about, which is what I believe that Russia, as well as China, is doing. And we've got to take advantage of that. Here in America, we see the diversity of its population. We continue to see its continued rise in interdependence around the world. And we have to take advantage of those. I mean, I take the opportunity to just look around this room, and we see how many people are from different places in the world. And we have to take advantage of what we have here at home and being able to take these relationships that we have with our own citizens and then to be able to expand those out back to our own home nations. Again, there are a lot of countries out there that want to be a part of our coalition. And again, if we don't take advantage of that, we will see that Russia will. Some of the things I go back to is Ho Chi Minh during Vietnam. We had people who wanted to align themselves with America, and we chose not to do that, and that was to our disadvantage in the long term. And so I would hope that that's a lesson that we would have learned, that, you know, despite that we feel that we are a superpower, we're a growing superpower, that, you know, America is first. To be first doesn't necessarily mean we have to be alone. And so I think there are a lot of countries, to include Russia, who realize that if I want to be first, I can't do that alone. As you've mentioned already, investments in Africa. Russia was very Eastern European. They were very focused inward. And they've come to realize that if we want to be a global superpower, we've got to look outward. We've got to be able to reach out to those who are willing, you know, to take them on, who are willing to invest with them, who have the same interests, who have some of the same goals, and to take advantage of those. We look at how the PRC has taken advantage around the world, coming into South America. You know, what's going on in the situation there? They're taking advantage of seeing, you know, there's an opening there. We have nations that, you know, sadly, they're not really interested in some of the goals and interests that we have. Right now, they're just trying to survive. And sometimes that means making deals that they generally would not do if they were in a position where they didn't have to do them. Sri Lanka. And so, you know, again, we have to be able to take advantage of that. We can't allow ourselves to be so arrogant to believe that we have a military that we do, that have capabilities that we have. We mentioned earlier about cyber. We've mentioned earlier about non-state actors. So we're in territory that we generally don't deal with regard to our military, with regard to our diplomacy. And we've got to be able to open our aperture with regard to how we build those relationships and how we take advantage of those partnerships. So I believe that going forward, those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to do. It may feel uncomfortable at first, which oftentimes doing something new will feel that way. But with practice and over time, we will get better at that. And so we have to not let ourselves be so dependent on what we're always so good at, which oftentimes we do as individuals as well. We tend to lean on what we're good at. And sometimes it becomes uncomfortable doing things differently. And we've got to get better. We've got to get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. And sometimes that may mean aligning yourselves with partners that you generally would not have thought would make good partners. So,
are those the same partners that Mike was talking about earlier, focusing on democracies, or are those focusing on perhaps other forms of government that provide economic opportunity? How do you square that circle?
and I would say doing both. That's part of being comfortable with being uncomfortable. Taking advantage of growing democracies, taking advantage of weak states that we can help make stronger states that become better partners and allies for us. So we've got to, as I mentioned earlier, be willing to open the aperture to be able to see how else not only can we assist with those weak nations becoming stronger nations through governance, through economics, through military cooperation, but we've got to take advantage, wherever possible. And so, again, we're not looking at compromising our beliefs. We're not looking at compromising our values. We're not looking at trying to take advantage of those that don't understand, but we're trying to take advantage, though, of organizations out there, of countries out there that want to partner with America, that want to be a part of raising their own countries out of poverty, being able to raise education, being able to, again, we all in general have the same goals and desires. And so it's just how we achieve those. And so continuing to align ourselves with countries out there that are interested in the way that we do, that's where we want to start. So,
Trina, I wonder if I could stay with you for just a moment. I know that one of the things you've been doing during your time at the War College is looking at issues of diversity and inclusion with regard to the armed services. And the armed services have really led the way in many regards throughout the 20th century and into the 21st in diversity and inclusion and laser-like focus on promotional possibilities. And we're very proud of that at Baruch College as the most diverse master's program at this level in this area in the United States. And we could talk a lot about that, but since we were founded in 1847, this has been one of our lodestars as well. Could you walk that, and I think you were just doing that, but I'd like to sharpen the conversation. Could you walk that into what our military looks like and how that fits into the fabric of American society as we think about these global challenges? How do we effectively leverage this strength and make us even stronger in this arena?
So I would have to first say that I've had such an opportunity with regard to diversity and the Army as a whole. I myself got to work during the Obama administration, where they worked to fully integrate women into the military across all the services. And so I served as a lead planner, if you will, for the Army with regard to doing that. And so that has already paid benefits. The services are increasing the number of females that are interested in not just joining the military, but in different areas of the military. And with that being said, we're 50%. I mean, we're
52,
we're exactly, and growing. And so taking advantage of the knowledge, taking advantage of the diversity, taking advantage of the perspectives that women bring to the organization. It's the same with looking at where people are coming from around the world. Again, we take advantage, or I should say we don't take advantage of the idea that so many want to be a part of what it is that we do. And so doing it legally, of course, is the expectation of that, and no one argues that. But the thing is not only do we want to be a diverse organization, we want to be an inclusive organization. And we find that oftentimes we don't realize that those two things actually go together if you want to be successful at doing that. And so as I mentioned earlier about having spent my last tour in Iraq at the strategic level, working with more than 20 other countries, it was amazing the number of questions that they had with regard to how they can better recruit women, how they could better get involved with the U.S., militarily speaking, diplomatically speaking, because they see how we are as an organization, as an army. They see how we are as a country. I mean, when you're looking at organizations like your own, where you have individuals that are from every state, within your country, when you have tens, dozens, hundreds of individuals from around the world that want to become a part of your institution. They want to know how to do that as well. And so that gives us an idea of our opponents. That gives us an idea of ways to think different. You know, sometimes people think different is bad. Different is very good. And when you have a military that has more information on those that you're fighting, or, you know, understanding the background, understanding where those opponents are coming from, it helps you to build a strategy to help deal with that. And so taking advantage of diversity, taking advantage of the inclusion, being able to, I mean, when we find ourselves around the world, the first thing we're looking for are who can speak the language, individuals who speak the language, individuals who can give us background on where it is that we're going into. Information is power. And so, you know, to go back to our last question, we were talking about Vladimir Putin. I mean, those are the things that he takes advantage of. He's looking for pockets of, you know, of Russians that are somewhere in the world. And that's where he wants to start, because he recognizes they know what's going on where they are. They understand the population. They understand the backgrounds. They understand the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats. And so that's what we have to do. We've got to be able to take advantage of the fact that we have individuals, again, from around the world that want to partner with us to be able to then take that. So how do you see things? Being able to see the world from a different view gives us a greater advantage, because now we're not just focused on one stream of things. And so again, having, you know, speaking from a female perspective, there are things that we would have never thought about in the military had we not had women in it. And it has made it a better organization. Minorities, you know, individuals with disabilities, things that you generally would not have thought of have now become a reality and an advantage because you've had different individuals in those organizations. And so that's only going to make us, going forward, a better military.
I've learned a lot just from Trina's presence on our trips. We talk diversity. I came from Human Resources Command, and in my engineer branch, we try to recruit folks who are, you know, maybe non-white, more engineers, African Americans, females, and we hit about 25% on the recruitment standpoint. But at the senior leader perspective, it gets down to about 6%. And what I've learned from her is this aspect of inclusion that just doesn't just apply internal to our organizations, but also applies from a multinational cooperation perspective. You can bring people to the table, whether it's in Iraq and Afghanistan, but if you don't include them, not just sitting at the table, but intellectually including them, then you start to lose them. They're physically there, but intellectually they're not there, because you don't know how to bring them into the fold. And this is an area, as I go into command, that I've given a lot of thought about, and I still need to give more thought about. How do I be more inclusive of people sitting around the table, not just getting them to the table, but what are their backgrounds, what are their values, where do they come from across the nation or across the world? It's a great thing about the Army is we recruit so many people from all over the place. I talked to a soldier the other day who was from Nepal. You know, following the earthquake, I believe it was 2015 earthquake in Nepal, he came and he's now living in the United States, and he joined the U.S. Army. You know, he joined the U.S. Army because he believed in this bigger thing. And now he's been in the Army for about 2 years, and I'm having a conversation with this young person who would have never been in the United States had it not been for this open arms that we brought him in on, and he wants to participate in democracy, and he wants to participate in this bigger world order. And we need to be more inclusive, not just diverse, but inclusive in terms of how we operate around the world.
Has that become more challenging recently? Because the open arms approach has arguably become a little bit more cramped in the last couple of years. And I know that that is, as we travel around the world doing our academic linkages, it is the difference in perception of how we welcome others and otherness has pivoted sharply over the course of not just the last 2, but really the last 3 or 4 years. Has that made it more difficult in the military, and has it made it more difficult to emphasize not just the presence of difference, but using that in an inclusive way to actually inflect your practice?
Yeah, we've got to be better at inclusiveness. Our adversaries use cooperation as a method of competition. You talked about Russia and Turkey. Well, Russia trying to use cooperation with Turkey to undermine their participation in NATO and so forth.
Right.
So cooperation is actually can be a way to achieve a broader end of breaking things apart. we have to do it better than our adversaries in terms of inclusiveness. Bring them in and actually really bring them in and listening to them from a regional perspective, because those regional solutions are probably going to be more powerful than us reaching from afar. Take the Venezuela situation, for instance, and how we've really relied on Chile and Brazil and Colombia to help come up with a solution for that area and enabling them from afar as opposed to just doing it directly. Sometimes I think that's lost in the media. We don't see the inclusiveness that we're trying to achieve, and it's often viewed as we're trying to do it alone. When we spend time overseas in Europe, it's a different media perspective, so you get a much broader perspective of the world and where the United States fits in than sometimes when you're here in the U.S.
Does anybody do it better than we do? Inclusiveness.
Inclusiveness, boy. There are, my kids did a mission trip in Haiti, and they talked about how do you get water? And Germany, all the water they drank was bagged, and it had made in Germany on it. And the way the Germans really pushed from a humanitarian aspect, and not just lead with a military side, but how do we lead with a USAID or State Department side? And when you get something that says made in Germany or made from a place, you kind of understand the values. When you see made in the USA, there's an underlying theme of values there. When you get something that says made in China, what's the value that's really being represented? Is it more interest or values? So I think the Europeans have done it really well. I think folks like Russia and China are trying to do it, but there's a theme there that their values aren't quite aligned with our desires. But then we can get into trouble when we try to push our values for Saudi Arabia, for instance. Nature doesn't like a void. If our presence in capital pulls out of places like that, other places will come in and they'll side with our adversaries instead of with us. So how do we build partners through cooperation? Because cooperation is becoming a means of competition. Our adversaries want to work just below the threshold of something, just below the threshold of conflict. They'll work in competition, just below the threshold of competition through cooperation. So trying to undermine us those ways, and we're a little late to the game, but I think we're coming pretty quick.
And I'm not sure there are too many countries that do it better than us. I'll be honest with you. As far as inclusivity goes, as far as maintaining that semblance and understanding and appreciation for diversity goes, I think what we're able to do within the military culture is make sure that we have an understanding within this culture that we're a values-based organization. I think we do a very fine job of establishing that vision up front from an ethical standpoint and understanding who we are and what we represent. That we're a diverse element that congregates together, that represents and is reflective of the entire geographic realm of the United States. We may have some underrepresentation in certain minorities. So where we have in the African American realm, for example, they may constitute roughly 13% of the population in the United States, and we have 18% in the Army, at least specifically. I can talk to that service, but it's probably fairly close, I think, across the board when you put the collective together. From the Latino perspective, we're underrepresented as a military. Interestingly enough, as it's a demographic that continues to rise in the United States quite significantly. Right. So we're underrepresented, where we have roughly 12% of the Army population is Latino, Hispanic, and right now about 19%, at least from 2017, early 2018 statistics, of what the true representation is demographically within the United States. But it doesn't matter. When we come together, the very first thing that soldiers understand is that we're mission-focused and oriented toward what we're trying to accomplish as an end state, brought down to us from the leadership and through the chain of command. And everything that we do has an ethical, has a values-based piece to it. And it's taught from day one, and it's continued. Every year we have mandatory requirements if it's not incorporated with day-to-day activities that we do. When somebody goes off the beaten path a little bit, we revisit to make sure that everybody understands firmly that we are that values-based organization. And there's a beauty to that, because sometimes in American society as a whole, that's not there. And military, being able to provide that uniform for somebody to come in to an organization like that, for some, that's a first-time exposure that they've ever had to understanding, wow, there's something bigger than themselves that's there. And that's one of the beauties of the military, because you alluded to the fact that we're sometimes at the cutting edge of trying to incorporate different realms, whether it be gender, whether it be race, whatever the case may be. That we do a pretty fine job of bringing that to bear early on and making sure that becomes pervasive in the culture as time progresses.
One of the things that you've been writing about is the AVF and some challenges in recruiting toward the AVF. I wonder, a two-part question there. How well are we served by the AVF? Member of our board, Colonel Jack Jacobs, is a fan of the AVF but wants a national public service component that would be military, and believes that that's a vital bonding element for the United States. Famously, something like under 2% of Americans have direct contact with the military, slightly larger if you think about family and friends. How are we doing with the AVF? Are there things that we need to patch, and how does it walk into this diversity and inclusion conversation that we've just been having?
That's a wonderful segue. So from one aspect, honestly, it's the direct linkage probably is roughly 2%. Less than 1% are currently serving in uniform. Right. And obviously over the course of time, we've seen that based on the growing population of the United States and the diminished requirements, I think, that exist in the military. We're always going to be a pendulum swing that's going to ebb and flow with regard to the size of the military force, and where we currently stand, that's where we are. Very different dynamic than, for example, post-Vietnam War, where we were thinking in terms of roughly 5% of the population, right? And part of this, there's a civil-military divide concern that exists. Part of this is, and I think that that's a good place to start with regard to this discussion. Is that divide continuing to grow? Is a schism truly in existence between the civilian population of the United States and its military, which is a little frightening if you think about it, because a divide that exists like that, a civilian population, like I'd alluded to, I think, earlier in the conversation in one of the earlier questions, is more apt to potentially use the military more frivolously. So that is a concern, and it's a growing one, because with 1%, less than 1% in uniform now, congressional members reflecting, I think, during this Congress right now, about 18 to 19% of those that had served, which is not unreasonable. It's not like the 70, 80% threshold that existed back in the early 80s time frame. But I think it's very important that the civilian population always keeps tabs on understanding precisely what the military is doing, so that doesn't occur. And that's I think the bigger underlying aspect to this. Where the frightening aspect of the divide is happening is that roughly 80% of those that do serve now had family members that had served, whether it be grandparents, parents, siblings, whatever the case may be. And that's a trend that doesn't seem to be diminishing. So this is something that I think that there has to be better communication and outreach, I think, collectively to the public to say, hey, service is an option. And this new generation Z that has come up thinks in those terms. I think in the back of their minds, they want to serve. They want to do something for the betterment not only of themselves, but do something that's more important. And thinking in terms of what's more important with regard to service to the nation, I think is something that will resonate with this next generation. We just have to communicate and for them to understand that the military is a viable option and a good option. Frankly, it offers many opportunities and occupations that you're going to see across the civilian sector, whether it be doctors, lawyers, infantrymen, cavalrymen, or aviators, and folks that work within those industries and the opportunities that abound with that. But it's not a good trend right now. I'll be frank about that.
Right. Okay, thank you. We have lots and lots of good questions here, which are hard to concatenate. But before we get into those, I have one more, and this is for all of you. And we began at the end last time. Let's begin at this end this time. What keeps you up most at night as you think about our current state of preparedness and the challenges that we face? Is it cyber? Is it our inability for political and other reasons to bring to conclusion some of these forever wars? Is it Russia's announcement of new weapon systems that, if we believe their videos, all of which are animations, but if we believe the videos, are enormously capable and potentially destabilizing in terms of balance of power, particularly the nuclear end. What's most frightening out there, and what are we doing about it, Trina?
Wow, very good question. So interestingly enough, all of those things that you mentioned, for me, I find the thing most scary is our inability to trust but verify. So, you hear about this echo chamber, of information where we hear something and we want to grab on it as being truth. We have a hard time where individuals will hear things, will learn about things, will read things, but then follow up, actually do some research, find several other sources that can validate, the information that we're finding. Individuals, we talk about being radicalized. They grab on to a situation, or we grab on to a problem, or we gravitate to an issue that we may find, some passion for. And rather than go out and try and learn as much information as we can about it, we tend to gravitate toward the information that confirms, so these confirmation biases. And I feel that those are the kinds of things that is most dangerous, because they can lead to unnecessary escalation of force. They can lead to misunderstanding and misinterpretation of actions that are being done by other countries or by ourselves, our own Congress, our own government, misunderstanding, mislabeling. And so because you can get online and start, a conversation and then, retweet, repost, and not go back and try and find original sources to that information, to try and go out and validate and verify that kind of information. Now you have individuals who've latched onto that without fully understanding, the end state. You continue to see stories where we've had individuals have decided that they want to go out and become members of ISIS because, they've received the video or what have you. Right. And then they become a part of it and realize, wow, this is not at all, what I thought it was. And, the same with information that we receive here at home. We allow ourselves to kind of go down the same path. We're reading the newspapers that verify what we want to say. We read and watch the television shows and the news programs and the pundits. And so not taking the opportunity to fully hear the other side and then making informed decisions and choices, those are the things, that's the thing that really keeps me up at night, that I find most frightening today.
Hear, hear. You'll be happy to know that in all of our method sequence, we spend a week talking about how you defeat your confirmation bias instincts, but very serious problem.
Yeah.
Mike?
Two things. The first, World War I, a long time ago, but how quickly did the world fall apart? Will the liberal international order fall apart in 1 week? Will we be marching hundreds of thousands of troops toward each other by next weekend? Because that's how quickly World War I essentially fell apart. That keeps me up. As autocracy grows and continues to test kind of democracy around the world and potentially undermine this liberal international order that we've established with an alternative authoritarian capitalist type system, will that fall apart in 1 week? That keeps me up. The second thing is when we deploy troops into harm's way, our families being taken care of. Mm-hmm. How are kids, my kids were, my daughter was 2 months old, my other one was 2 years old, going on 3. How will they perform in school when their families are far from home? What kind of impacts does that make? And you're talking years later when now these kids are applying to colleges and maybe they didn't do so great in school because their families were rotating away. And what kind of dynamic does that put on the families? That keeps me up at night. How well can we keep families together as a military culture, and how well do they integrate back into society? When I left Afghanistan in 2011, I went to the Rand Corporation to do research, flew into LA, and wow, I was from a war zone into Venice Beach. Talk about being way away from the war. And the dynamics there of saying, man, we lost 30 people in Afghanistan. And here I am, and it's like the war is so far away. And do they understand what families go through when that occurs? That's what keeps me up.
Just a real quick follow. Is there a specific plan or basket of plans in the military to address that problem right now?
I think it needs to be a national plan. I don't think it's just a military plan.
Okay.
In 2004, when my soldiers were fighting and I had 10 wounded in 1 week, we didn't have a great system of support. It was, General Kim, the Army, or the commanding general of the Army War College. He was a lieutenant colonel at the time. I was a captain. His wife and my wife would be the ones to visit families after they were wounded, after their spouse was wounded. Now we have a much more robust system that take care of families, but maybe we're not investing in that as much because soldiers aren't coming back as wounded as we were at peak times. And then what is the national plan for taking care of these folks? So we don't have to rely on young 20 and 30-year-old spouses to take care of family whose soldiers are also in the fight at the same time.
Right. Thank you. V.
So I would almost go as well, and I think a two-front piece in here a little bit is one aspect is I think China is going to be our bigger concern over the horizon as time progresses here. But we have to be very careful with regard to how we're approaching that issue, and this falls more in the vein of the domestic side of the house. From a constructivist realm, we don't want to ensure that we're rallying folks around the flag to create and generate an adversary that's thought through in an image that we don't want portrayed just yet. So it has to be a progressive piece to make sure that the American public as a whole understands where we stand, but not get so radicalized in their notions and their ideas that China is such a threat that it mandates war at any given time. And I think deterrence is the right perception, a right way to perceive how we need to think in terms of China right now, which is, I think, appropriate for the time being. How things will happen over the horizon, I think time will tell, and that will obviously be based on political relationships. But going back to the domestic front and how we look at things, I think that there's an unhealthy divide right now in politics where the schisms are growing further and further to extremes. And the rhetorics that we espouse, much like the constructivist concerns that I have here, are ones that I think are truly things that keep me up at night. I think the political dynamic needs to come back towards the middle where we can actually have civil conversations amongst politicians once again to come to consensus to make sure that our political aims are clear. Which then ties in directly to what our military aims will be. And so my biggest concern, honestly, is on the domestic front and the health of the governance of America.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I have boodles and boodles of questions here. They don't easily lend themselves to concatenation, so I'm going to take them as individually as I can. I will note at the top that we have a precisely even split between people who asked landscape questions and people who asked portrait questions. And we'll be doing a psychological study, the results of which will be available at the next Marx Issues Forum. So the first question, I'm going to ask, a couple of these are for individuals, but the rest are for any of you. Don't feel the need for each person to respond to each, but whoever wants to jump in. The first one, how does climate change and the impact of migration affect how the military is used, and does it impose a new dynamic on the military? And you should know, by the way, that we debuted the World Bank's report on forced internal climate change from this stage exactly a year ago today. So you're in good geographic company.
So I can start on that one. The Army Corps of Engineers, which runs a lot of the waterways around the U.S. and does a lot of civil construction for society, they could easily see costs increase. One of the officers who's with us there at the Army War College is going to be the district commander in New Orleans. So you think about New Orleans and Katrina and the impacts of just water on running the city. And the Army is very involved in these sorts of higher cost impacts and how do we reduce them. So that's the climate change piece. The immigration one's interesting because we also have a lot of engineers on the border right now. Multiple battalions, and a battalion's a couple hundred folks, so you're talking over 1,000 soldiers on the border just putting up concertina wire. And does the money that the Corps of Engineers uses to protect cities from future climate change get diverted to build walls, because it's still the Army Corps of Engineers, which is kind of doing both of those, responding to both of those things. Those are policy decisions, and that's sort of analysis that you have to rely on the Congressional Budget Office and other places for, but you know, the pot is not growing of resources, and those are policy decisions that cause resources to shift very quickly, and what are the long-term implications for those things?
I'll expand a little bit with regard to projection of power and how we think in terms globally with regard to the climate as a whole. To put things into context a little bit, in 1950, urbanization, urban versus rural, you're looking at about 1/3 urban population as a world to 2/3 rural. So 1/3 urban to 2/3 rural. The trend line is moving towards 2050 being the precise opposite, 2/3 urban and 1/3 rural. And what happens now when we start to see larger city infrastructures, mega cities that expand beyond 1 million, and in an exponential manner? What kind of wars over the horizon, and what are we going to expect the military to encounter and have to deal with as time progresses? That is something that I think the military is very steeped in, with exploring options and even thinking in terms experimentally of what types of units are going to be required to address those issues. From a land force perspective, from the Army, that's one incredible challenge, honestly, to have to overcome. Urban fighting is an ugly mess. It is not clean, and it is demanding an incredible amount of manpower to actually deal with seizing terrain. It's quite a challenge. So I think that is coming into play with regard to thinking in terms of modernization and force structure requirements over the horizon. And we're going to see the dynamics of that shift when we think 20, 30 years out now, and the understanding of the projection that we're going to have less rural environments and more concerns within cities.
Okay, thank you. Please discuss the current role of contract or corporate soldiers. I guess we're thinking about a sort of a Blackwater environment, and how this affects our future, and how it affects the governmentally sponsored military.
Do you want to take contracts?
Sure, yeah, no, I'm
Eric Prince is not listening. So.
Eric Prince is not, so, I think that some of that tends to go with the political landscape as a whole as well. So I think that that there were some significant trend lines that existed with regard to trying to shift the dynamics of requirements that exist out there away from the military, if you can afford to do so, because frankly, contracting is cheaper. To be able to contract out individuals, although it seems very expensive, it doesn't equate to the same as having soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in their careers, all the requirements that exist for them, over the horizon, day-to-day requirements for their families, and then thinking in terms of retirement. It's actually less expensive overall to do contracting. But is that something desirable for the population as a whole to think in terms of pushing forward contractors? Now, the majority of contractors that are leveraged, that do go forward, are not working in terms of a combat arms or maneuver fires and effects capacity. They're logistical arms. They're assisting with food support. Many of these things are contracted out to allied and partner nations to be able to actually leverage individuals from across the world to come in and assist as well. And that's, I think you have to think in those terms with regard to who the contractors are, generally speaking, that assist us in conducting the requirements for our military interests abroad. I think that lessons have been learned from the past with regard to Blackwater. There are always concerns with regard to going into ethical violations and concerns that, obviously I talked about the values-based organization that we exist in may not necessarily be pervasive in a contract organization. And in fact, they won't be, frankly, because it's not part of their culture as it is with ours. And that's something that obviously we have to continue to reconcile. I think you're seeing that we may see leveraging over the horizon for additional assistance with regard to security force assistance. But I think that serious lessons have been learned with how we leverage our contractors from both of the, Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think as a result, you've seen a trend line of lesser concerns and lesser problems.
So I will share something, and this is more about this is more of a comment that I learned as a member of the War College, how some other countries see us, the U.S. military, with regard to this particular question. So I'm not really sure how many of you all realize, but when we deploy, there are generally incentives, if you will. We don't refer to them as such, but the government does. So things like combat zone tax exclusion. So you're in a combat zone, there's no taxes being levied towards our wages. And so other countries actually see us as the contract military, because many of them only receive whatever pay that they've already received, whether they're at home or they're deployed. And so I just really found that interesting, that other countries see us that way, which was never a perspective I would have ever seen. Right. You just see that as, okay, that's just, part and parcel with, with deploying. And so, to see myself as a mercenary, if you will, as I just found that really interesting. And so I just thought I would share that because, again, when we talk about diversity, when we talk about working with other countries, talking about how our partners and allies see us and us seeing them, I just wanted to share that perspective because, again, it was not at all something how I saw myself. And again, that is kind of where we first go to, is the black waters and the actual civilian companies that are contracted for services and other support. So
we've all taken the oath that says that, I solemnly swear to support the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Who do you want to represent you and your values as a nation when you go forward? Do you need somebody who's taken that oath, or do you need somebody in other areas that may have not taken that oath? Private military contractors is a way, a means, and we've seen, for instance, Russia use it extremely well. In a matter of 72 hours, a Venezuela situation happening where hundreds are flying into the city. Right. You're not going to put troops on the ground. You could put troops on the ground that fast, but politically you're not going to that fast. So there's perhaps a mismatch of means when you want to use somebody who has taken that oath and has those values, and somebody who's just has interest when they're going into a place.
And in Russia's case, that dividing line might be a little grayer.
And they leverage that for attribution purposes often as well, right?
Right.
So.
Okay. One questioner wants to know, in a political era where NATO has been revised and its aims slightly rerouted, how can NATO still be a successful deterrent? And I'd encourage you to think more broadly as well about NATO and its role. We talked a little bit about the 2% demands, but where does NATO stand today, and how does it fit into our collective defense? Small question.
I'm more than happy to discuss this, and this is we're coming up on 70 years now, I think, with the alliance. So it's a sound alliance, honestly, and it's expanded significantly with the integration of Montenegro fairly recently, I think that the point at which there were concerns now with the Russian Federation happened in 2004 with the integration of the Baltics. And it cut a little too close with an understanding from a Russian standpoint, not only through the eyes of President Putin, who reflects his society as a whole, the dynamic of their anti-Western sentiment from a historical standpoint, and frankly, a little bit of paranoia, I think, that exists as well. We see ongoing friction between the Russian Federation and the alliance on a continuous basis. That's not only in the Baltics, but obviously what's continuing to happen within Ukraine and the concerns with the Ukrainian efforts in the Donbas situation. I think the alliance has done a very good job, honestly, of maintaining that sense of integrity. one aspect and one concern is there's a Gallup poll that came out in 2016, I want to say, that specifically asked the populations collectively within many of the alliance nations as to whether or not they would be willing, the populace would be willing to accept a Article 5 notion within the NATO treaty, which is collective defense. Should an attack on one sovereign state within the alliance actually occur, would the others come to their defense? And there are many countries where the majority of the populations said no, they would not within that alliance. And that brought up, I think, a sort of an alarming sense of whether or not they were true to form with regard to that alliance piece. I think that the government and the military arms, however, do have an appreciation in our interactions with the military, and my personal ones. I think NATO military members have a good sense of what kind of threat exists and how to address deterrence issues. We do a very good job collectively as an alliance, us being one of the NATO member allies, of ensuring that we have enhanced force protection rotations within the Baltic realms and within Poland, that we continue to maintain a presence there, but also striking that balance of making sure that that graduated response for deterrence doesn't ping so far that we're pushing forward a provocation towards that Russian Federation. And that's always that balance that we're trying to strike in how we're addressing the issue. But I think that we're doing that effectively as an alliance as a whole. I think you're seeing economically that 2% expectation. I think that all of the Baltics have brought themselves up to that 2% realm, and a good portion, at least most of the NATO alliance members see that 2% threshold over the horizon and how they're going to achieve that based on milestones, and that preserving their own security is a huge piece. We, in turn, have increased our percentage of OCO funds, Overseas Contingency Operation funds, that is part of the monies that go down to the military as a whole to leverage across the board. Part of that goes towards our European Deterrence Initiative, and we've expanded that quite substantially. And I want to say it's upwards of $6.5 billion. And so all of that is in an effort for deterrence that feeds into the alliance's contribution to think in those terms. And I think that overall, even though there are some elements that show there might be a few cracks and fissures here, I think the collective alliance is focused in the right direction for deterrence.
It's a political military question that you should ask deeply. What does supporting an alliance really mean? Is it just something on paper? Is it something we use rotational troops for? Or is it something you're willing to position families forward for? South Korea, for instance, there's a lot of families there. It would have sent a very big political symbol if we decided we were going to evacuate families out of South Korea. That is a big signal. We've brought a lot of families out of Germany now and reduced our forces there when we thought Russia was going to be a partner. But that may have created a gap for them to backfill in terms of presence. So do you want rotational presence, or do you want more of a permanent presence forward? What is the cost of maintaining that alliance? And do we really ask those deep questions? Because rotational forces can end at the end of a rotation. You just stop sending them. Where if you have families and housing positioned forward, there's a big cost to that also, because they could be somewhere else in the United States getting educated and spending dollars.
Okay. I'd like to ask a pair of questions from different questioners, but I think they dovetail with one another. So one is a general piece and one leaps from a specific case to a somewhat more general question. The most general question is, what is the role of the military in promoting human rights? And I'll backstop that. One of our audience members says, I played a role in killing millions of Vietnamese in a war that should never have been fought. I live continually with guilt as a result. I think there's a consensus that the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq were also mistakes. How does today's military deal with all the civilian deaths there? So human rights, collateral damage, and its impact on the military overall.
So 241 or so million people died in the 20th century. from war and conflict, 160 million of them from genocide alone. Most of that genocide was done by autocracies. So when do you as a nation want to get involved in stopping a genocide in Syria, in Bosnia, and what is the policy implications for that? You know, when there was genocide in the Balkans, we eventually went there with U.S. military presence. That resulted in nation building. Do you really want to do that? Or do you not want to commit a military presence and allow the genocide to occur? Those are tough questions. When you see millions of people migrating away from a conflict, or when you see the images of people dying, that touches to all of our hearts, and you want to get involved, but there's very long-term implications with that as great powers start to get involved in places like Yemen between Iraq and, Saudi Arabia and Iran. You know, those are tough policy implications. Then when you do get involved, war is very complicated. There's a lot of friction. There's a lot of chance. And how are you more precise in your application of military power to reduce civilian casualties? We have to do a lot of training on our part to make sure we don't do that. And it's unfortunate that soldiers and service members have to live with themselves when those incidents do occur. We hope they are not purposeful, and that we don't want accidents. Accidents do occur, unfortunately, and that is the nature of violence and the nature of war. Do you want to go to war for a humanitarian purpose, and what are the implications of doing that?
I think we should not forget at home the number of lives we've lost here on our own homeland, our own soil, with regard to human rights, civil rights. You know, that plays into our founding fathers' values and beliefs and interests here at home. And so when we project that power out in the world, you know, we shouldn't forget that those things are at the forefront. Our values, our own beliefs, you know, do we feel that if those things were happening here at home, how would we react to that? And then how would we want, you know, the rest of the world to participate in assisting us in resolving those? You know, our government plays, you know, it has a very heavy burden. You know, when you know, see yourself as a superpower, when you see yourself as a role model, you know, for the world, we may not always get it right. You know, we didn't mention, you know, about Rwanda, you know, the genocide going on there, and a lot of African nations as well, where you saw genocide. We saw that in Asian countries where we saw that there was genocide there. And so, you know, we may not always get it right, and they don't get it right at home either. And so it is always a conflict of, do we get involved or do we not get involved? And then if we do get involved, how? And then if we don't, why not? So very tough questions. And, you know, as Mike has already said, you know, I mean, the nature of war is violent. And so, again, it becomes a matter of what stance are we going to take? So,
I think it's an interesting political question that I think we've seen kind of change during each administration as time has progressed here with regard to human rights and where that exists within the values of the nation. Because the military is an instrument, simply one of the instruments of national power. We're the blunt force instrument, and that's why it should be preserved as a method of last resort if at all feasible, I think, my personal opinion. But human rights and that aspect, where that exists within the vital interests of the United States and how we project our influence abroad has changed. I think post-World War II, we think in terms of the ongoing progression from a neoliberal perspective of how we're going to think in terms of the democratic peace theory and how we're going to be able to try to expand, be that beacon on the hill to expand democracy abroad. We've seen that since start to close more and more as we see more authoritarian governances, more autocracies develop over the course of time. And it's also not a priority anymore. When we think in terms of our vital interests, we have four. There's security, American prosperity, the deterrence aspect of preserving the peace by preparing for war, and American influence. But what does that American influence piece signify? Can you wrap that human rights realm into that American influence sphere? And is the populace, is the will there to push forward a military arm specifically for a human rights issue that exists? And that's something that we have to reflect as a society. And I will tell you that after 1920, coming up on 20 years of war, we will have been in war for 2 decades now. Are segments of our society battle weary? Are they not willing to push forward the military and thinking in terms of it being an element of last resort? And I think that we've seen during this administration collectively more of an initiative to bring back things towards the United States internally as opposed to thinking projecting abroad. But that inevitably will switch at some point in time. Right now, frankly, human rights is a very, very significant thing. But it is not, it is only remotely nested with regard to that American influence realm, even though we do have to revert back, obviously, to the values of the founders of the nation and what the Constitution represents.
A terrific conversation. I wish that we could continue this all morning. Please join me in thanking our panelists, and join me as well in thanking the War College for this Eisenhower program, because I think, as we learned here today, it's a tremendous opportunity to share perspectives, to be frank, to cover a lot of territory, and we have covered a lot of territory, but very important questions with which we all have a duty as citizens to remain intimately engaged.